Great, thank you. Thank you, Jan. I'm going to share my screen here now. Jan, could you enable share screening, the screen sharing?
Yes, I did. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
So it's interesting.
Well, my grandmother's parents.
Okay, can you see my?
That's a Mayo.
I'm sorry.
1917.
There's somebody that's in the background that
sell everything, go home, and you can die.
Chris, I muted everybody, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, great. Jan, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Are you seeing my slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, just wanted to start off by saying thank you to Maud, particularly Emily, Maddie, and Jan for hosting a great event once again under these challenging circumstances. I know it's not our preferred method here, but all of you are doing a great job in hosting this event. So just want to say thank you there. As with all of the Platinum sponsors, Maud has offered us a 15-minute window ahead of the next presentation to chat with you about our company. But don't worry, I will not be spending the next 15 minutes chatting about Houston. As engineers and scientists, we're actually mostly introverts and we really don't like talking about ourselves anyway. And regardless, I really don't think you really want to hear about a commercial about us anyway. So instead, I'll just take this opportunity to thank all of you watershed districts for the work you do in protecting our water resources and the communities and collaborating with partner agencies, including those projects and programs that are a topic of today's concurrent sessions, and have a couple of graphics shown on the screen here of those 3 areas that we're speaking about. And of course, this one is about the Rice Creek Watershed District rules today. In particular, we wanted to provide a special thanks for all of the watershed districts who we have worked with in the last year. We have a graphic and a list of them on the screen here. We love working with all of you as you're all great people to work with. And we do appreciate that opportunity to collaborate on solutions that make a positive difference in your communities. So again, thank you all very much. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to be turning this over now to our featured presentation, and I will be introducing the speaker in the presentation today. So the speaker is Patrick Hughes. He is with the he is the permit coordinator and wetland specialist for the Rice Creek Watershed District. As the lead of the regulatory program, Patrick managed the effort to revise the Rice Creek Watershed District's rules in 2020. I was fortunate enough to work with Patrick on this rule revision. It was quite a process. It had a lot more complexity and nuance than I had expected going into it, but it was definitely rewarding, not only to make a difference in the district's resources, but also, as the title notes, to feel like I was a king for a day. So with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Excellent. Thanks for the introduction, Chris. Yes, as stated, my name is Patrick Hughes. Good day, everyone. And I'm the permit coordinator and wetland specialist for the Rice Creek Watershed District. The presentation today is called If I Were King for a Day, a little bit of fun there, and focuses on the hows and whys of undergoing a regulatory rule revision for a watershed district. Throughout the presentation, I will use RCWD's 2020 rule revision process as a real-life example for how this works. All right, so starting it off here, revising an organization's rules is a multi-step process that must follow State Statute 103D.341. On this slide is a figure that represents a general how of the steps in this process. This is a simplified graphic. and many other steps are or may be included along the way. The first step here, staff recommends rule change. It is a very critical piece and may present itself in a variety of ways and even over a multi-year period. At Rice Creek, we do keep a working document of potential changes to consider. These considerations do come from staff, also our board of managers, and even folks outside of our organization. These considerations, once the proposed changes are considered, we move to the next step there. The board of managers does set a public hearing and begins a 45-day public comment period. Any and all comments that are received during this process, the hearing and the comment period, are transcribed and responded to as the proposed rule language is finalized. Then the board adopts the revised rules by resolution and starts an effective start date. And again, this is a general overview and simplified version of the process here. So this represents the how of the rule revision process, but we must also ask the important question of why. Okay, so why change your rules? There are many considerations when answering this question, which include alignment with a watershed management plan, input from stakeholders. This can be cities, counties, other local agencies, state agencies, and even private landowners. Also, you have the efficiency of administration, the burden placed on applicants to meet the rules, and overall clarity in the rule. Over the presentation, I will dive into each of these bullets with greater detail. Furthermore, I will relate the content of the presentation to the rule revision that RCWD underwent in 2020. Our organization's process was detailed and long, as Chris mentioned, as we attempted to transfer the whys into the how. The previous rule revision ahead of that occurred in 2016, yet we still found that we had many new goals that we wanted to accomplish. So that first consideration here is alignment with a watershed management plan. Each organization's rules must align with their adopted plan. The plan is the reason for the rules and trumps all other proposals. Every watershed district is required to complete an updated watershed management plan every 10 years. So at a minimum, it may be prudent to consider what changes need to be made utilizing this time frame, but it certainly can occur more frequently. RCWD, for instance, we updated our rules in 2013, 2014, 2016, and again in 2020, as we continually work to improve our regulatory administration. So the first example here is a conflict that we had between our watershed management plan and our rules relating to drainage systems. Our WMP identified both public drainage systems as they relate to Minnesota Statute 103E and private drainage systems, which are independent of Statute 103E, as separate management categories. So in our rules that both private and public drainage were covered under the same rule, unfortunately, Rule I, and there was an additional Rule G that regulated strictly crossings and culverts of these systems. So the rule set as it was at the time caused both internal and external confusion on what systems were regulated and what work was allowed. So then as part of our latest rule revision process, we explored why this alignment was important. First and foremost, as the drainage authority, Rice Creek's management of 103E systems is inherently different than non-103E systems. Any work on the 103E systems requires our involvement and should be regulated by rule. However, for non-103E systems, we had to consider how much involvement we did want to have. The term drainage system was defined in our rule, and that was as a system of open channel, pipe, or tile to drain property. So it was very general and didn't have a lot of specifics. So covering all non-103E systems, regardless of size, would have been a burden with likely very little benefit. We therefore elected to regulate private systems only when they convey greater than 200 acres and cross multiple properties. We found that these systems have a regional benefit, and we determined their capacity needed to be maintained. The rule update also clarified that repair or replacement of regional conveyance systems owned by a government entity would not need a permit if the hydraulic capacity of that system would not change. So for instance, some work on storm sewer. So our solution then for the rule to align with the Watershed Management Plan was to revise Rule G to be strictly for regional conveyance systems and revise Rule I to strictly cover 103E public drainage systems. This change would meet our Watershed Management Plan and still provide clarity in the rule. So we did have that better alignment. Lastly, on this section, before we move to the next considerations, RCWD's means of demonstrating that alignment with our Watershed Management Plan was further identified through a statement of need and reasonableness, or SONAR. So the SONAR itself was a document that comprised of both a technical memorandum from the district engineer, Houston Engineering, and also a letter from our legal counsel. The SONAR sought to address how each of the following here were met for every substantive revision that we included. So this includes who is affected by the rule, the costs to both agencies and applicants, what alternatives were considered, consequences of not adopting the rule, differences between our rule and federal requirements, and the cumulative effects with other state and federal rules. So the next consideration is input from stakeholders. So while the recommended changes for the rule typically come from internal staff or board, it is important and critical to consider external sources for what revisions may be necessary. For RCWD, one of the initial sources of comments relating to rule revision came from our Watershed Management Plan update. We worked on updating our WMP both in 2018 and 2019. So these comments were even really before we began that rule revision process. The WMP process was a major collaborative effort, and throughout it did generate 32 comments that related to rule modification. Most of these comments from the process were from cities within our district and also state agencies. Of the 32 comments, 15 of these were unique considerations and not related to the same topic. Additionally, we received several comments that were requesting opposite action. So examples of this conflicting feedback included standardizing our rules to match adjacent watershed management organizations versus adopting mid standards. And we also had comments of adding more robust erosion control requirements versus kind of getting away from that effort and leaving erosion control standards to cities. So as part of that Watershed Management Plan approval process, we itemized the comments that we received and directly responded to each of them. Generally, some comments were addressed through the WMP update. Some did not align with the plan and weren't found as relevant. And then some we did elect to address later through our formal rule revision process. And then on the right here, so another method of generating external comments is through stakeholder meetings. For Rice Creek, we do host biannual, as in twice per year, meetings, which we refer to as city-county partner meetings. These meetings are sent out to cities, counties, state agencies, et cetera. So RCWD, we did hold a city-county partner meeting in May of 2020. So this was near the beginning of our latest rule revision process. We found that having this meeting early in the process allowed us to engage with our partners and to identify common themes in the comments we received during the Watershed Management Plan process, explain how those comments were addressed, share our likely substantive changes that were coming in the rule, and to elicit further feedback from our partners before the draft rule was noticed for public comment. So you can see in the bottom here, this is just an example of how we listed those comments and responded to them. And then another opportunity for stakeholder input is through the formal statutory rule process itself. So once the draft language is complete, our draft rule was accepted by our board of managers. They set a public hearing and started the 45-day public comment period. So in that process, we did notice both a version of the proposed rule with track changes and one without. And we did also send out the before mentioned sonar for folks to review. Through the public comment period and the public hearing, we did receive 21 comments. Most of those were written. I think one of them did come at the formal public hearing. Most of the comments that we received sought simple clarification in the rule language, and 3 of the comments did result in further adjustment in the rule. All 3 of those adjustments were to Rule I for those public drainage systems. So our experience, we found that if stakeholder engagement is accomplished early and often, few new substantive comments from those agencies should be received during the actual formal process. So a specific example of a rule change that came from public comment relates to our stormwater management rule. Rule C, multiple comments that we received during the Watershed Management Plan process requested better alignment of our rules to the state's MS4 requirements. This modification would simplify the design process for permit applicants as they try to meet both city, state, and watershed district standards. Unfortunately here, the MPCA was also in the midst of updating the MS4 permit at the same time we were undergoing our process. So as we proposed our rule changes, we had to ensure that we were up to date with the latest MS4 criteria and language as well. We did adjust our stormwater management rule to match the proposed MS4 water quality treatment standard for public linear projects. Prior to that change, our rule had a trigger threshold of 10,000 square feet of new impervious surface and did not require treatment for reconstructed surfaces as it relates to public linear projects. So to align with the MS4 permit, we updated our rule to once again include reconstruction as requiring treatment. And we also increased our trigger threshold from that 10,000 square foot mark to 1 acre in total for both new and reconstructed surfaces. And then also shown in the figure here, the water quality treatment requirement that we then had for public linear projects was also updated as shown in this calculation. This rule change so met our partners' concerns, met our watershed management plan goals, and demonstrated then alignment with the state standards. And then a critical piece here at the bottom too, as a follow-up, we have continued engagement with our partners so that the effects of this rule change are understood as we proceed with administering this new rule. The third consideration is the efficiency of the administration. So as a rule set is administered through the permit process, it may be identified that some of the provisions require significant time, resources, and effort in administering. This is a burden not only on watershed district staff, but is also typically a burden on applicants, their consultants, and their entire team. It is important to identify these provisions and assess which can be modified or removed without reducing the goals of the watershed management plan or negatively affecting the resource. As we found, oftentimes these challenges identify themselves through frequent variance requests from applicants in their proposals. One of the challenges that we found in our rule was from our buffer requirement in our wetland alteration rule. In short, projects along the rule identified wetland management corridor were required to establish a 25-foot minimum, 50-foot average upland buffer. This presented a common challenge for applicants and resulted in numerous variance requests. Practically, not all areas could meet the 25-foot minimum, and requiring a 25-foot minimum along something like curbed areas with no runoff would add little or no additional resource protection. Additionally, working with applicants on design alternatives or reviewing variance applications resulted in lots of additional administrative time and cost. So as part of our process, this portion of the rule was reviewed and identified and changed in an attempt to reduce the hardship and reduce the likelihood of variance applications while still providing sufficient resource protection. The revised rule still requires a 50-foot average buffer, but the 25-foot minimum is now only required in areas of hard surface inflow. So this change doesn't require the 25-foot in all locations, and it does allow for flexibility in applicant site design while still providing equivalent wetland protection. So similar to the efficiency of administration is the consideration of burden on permit applicants. Essentially, is the regulation worth the cost? So the cost to applicants is a factor that should be considered, particularly if the rule standard doesn't significantly move the needle toward achieving watershed district goals. It is important to review the cumulative effects of the rule requirement with the associated cost of administering versus the benefit to the resource. You can then determine the tipping point where that resource benefit trails off. An excellent example from our process related to our floodplain alteration rule. The purpose of this rule is to preserve capacity within the 100-year regulatory floodplain across the district and minimize the frequency and severity of high water. In general, the rule requires compensatory storage mitigation when filling within the floodplain. However, in the past rule, we did allow for a one-time exemption of up to 10 cubic yards of fill material without needing mitigation. The rule also sought frequent variance requests from applicants, noting the difficulty in meeting this 10 cubic yard exemption for things such as road projects and small sites like single-family homes. So our RCWD staff and our district engineer, we investigated where that tipping point was in the cost-benefit analysis. To do so, our engineer reviewed all floodplain alteration permits that were issued over a 10-year period and assessed the cumulative impact of that regulation. It was determined that permitted projects that included between 10 cubic yards and 100 cubic yards of fill resulted in a negligible amount of flood protection. The cumulative amount of fill over this 10-year period would not have a measurable increase in the regulatory flood elevation. And that is even when we took all of those permits and theoretically aggregated them to a single floodplain area and not just district-wide. So the conclusion there was therefore to increase that one-time fill exemption allotment up to 100 cubic yards. And the final consideration that I have here today is for rule clarity. Fundamentally, does everybody understand the rule? This includes watershed district staff itself, but also applicants, consultants, public partners, etc. So while the clarity is a pretty straightforward idea, what are the reasons and benefit for this clarity? Clear rules would increase the consistency in administration with all staff, engineers, etc., interpreting the rule the same way. Additionally, you would see fewer incomplete permit applications and also questions from the applicant in trying to meet the rule criteria. You'd also find reduced staff time in review of the applications, and also an overall reduced cost to both the district and the applicant. So there were a few different ways that RCWD improved clarity in our rule process. First was that we corrected references to both internal and external documentation. We aimed to ensure that any out-of-date references were updated or removed as necessary. So as shown in the bottom here with these two screen grabs from the rule, we generalized a reference to the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. Not referencing that chapter would allow for updates externally to that manual without our rule being outdated. And then on the second one here, we also updated an incorrect ASTM soil boring standard reference. Next, we updated to modern design and survey standards. This is from our stormwater management rule shown here. The reference was to clearly state that Atlas 14 precipitation data would require a nested distribution in developing rainfall hydrographs. We also updated to modern submittal systems. As shown here in the past, we did require hard copies of all permit application materials, and that did include full-size civil plan sets. We have now transitioned, even before COVID-19 then, to a more digital format for applicants. This would reduce clutter and documents at the district office, save cost, and make for a simpler permit application process. Also in the future, we are exploring the idea of an online application through our website. And lastly, we memorialized our review criteria and other unwritten policies. The references shown here relate to, once again, Rule I for public drainage systems. These two references were part of our internal review checklist and were not explicitly known to applicants as a requirement. So including this information in the rule would make it clear to applicants what they need to have, in their design, and what standards to meet, and should reduce the back and forth between our review staff and them during the application process. So in conclusion, the overall purpose of the rule revision is to achieve the goals of the Watershed District while efficiently and effectively administering the regulatory program and in minimizing costs to both the Watershed District and the applicant. The process of revising the rules always starts with widespread engagement, including internal staff and consultants, the board of managers, and of course, stakeholders. Our latest RCWD rule revision took approximately 1 year to complete. As with most work over the past year and a half, there were challenges due to the COVID-19 outbreak. Our process also included a significant amount of stakeholder engagement through the Watershed Management Plan process, city-county partner meetings, and even internal workshops. There was also the added complexity, like I mentioned, in attempting to align with the MS4 permit update before it also was finalized in 2020. In the end, we could have had a shorter process, but if we were to make a recommendation, it would also be to allocate approximately a year from start to finish. This would allow for flexibility in meeting any challenges that pop up while still meeting a target implementation date. And my final point here is that following up with your stakeholders after rule adoption is critical. Their input was essential as the rule language was finalized, and it is important that they understand what changes were made and why. And of course, a big thank you to everyone who assisted and made the rule revision process happen, and also assisted with this presentation today. So some of the RCWD regulatory staff, a huge thanks to them, but also significantly to Houston Engineering and Smith Partners. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks may have. Sorry, I wasn't able to look at the chat there. Looks like we do have a few things in here.
Yeah, if you'd like, I could read those off here for you, Patrick. First one was from John Rochline. He had a comment at the Sauk River Watershed District has developed a fillable PDF application packet, allow folks to apply for permits digitally or via hard copy. This has made the application process more streamlined and easier for applicants, whichever way they want to apply. The fee still needs to be mailed and delivered to office via check. And he asked, does anyone collect fees with credit or a debit card payment?
Yeah, it's a good question, one we've considered as well. So currently we do accept fees through check. We don't have the opportunity for a credit card or debit card payment, but it is something that we are exploring in addition to an online permit application process. So we're not quite there yet, but it is something that we're looking at. I guess maybe I'd also mention too, I think there are some watershed districts in the metro that do collect credit card fees. Gosh, I'm trying to think of who it might be, but I think that Capital Region might be one of them.
Then the next question was from Catherine Sesnick. She asked, was there any specific effort included for addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the rule revision process?
I guess if Catherine could clarify the question, maybe unmute and maybe dive into that a little bit further, I'd be happy to answer it.
Hi, this is Catherine. I'm on the Bassett Creek Watershed Commission, and we're starting to plan to address our update our watershed plan, which is a long ways out, not till 2025. But in any case, we're starting to look at how to include diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And one of the ideas we have is to set up a conference to train us on how to do that. So basically just looking for general ideas on if you stumbled across that, if you made any specific effort for it. We're looking for ideas on how to bring in underrepresented groups into our process as much as possible.
Yeah, an excellent point. I don't know if that's anything that we explicitly explored in our latest process, but like I mentioned before, we do keep a running document. We're always thinking about what is coming next. So, I mean, that is something that we could be looking at. I might also mention we're working to finalize an update to our permit application fee schedule. So that is something too that we're kind of looking at. How can, the district not require 100% costs to applicants and, in reviewing their applications, the district to take on some of that burden. So we are looking at updating our fee schedule, making it a little simpler for folks, and kind of breaking it out into, some of the more detailed review with stormwater management, and then some of the more administrative review, having a smaller flat fee.
The next question is from Mike Eisensee. He asked, has Rice Creek Watershed District considered assisting communities within the district to review their rules to address the same issues, rule alignment, efficient administration, and improved clarity between the rules?
Yeah, a good question. And I guess that's why we try to have that engagement as much as possible with our partners. I guess, we did receive a number of comments when we were doing our process in trying to make things aligned. So I think, updating to the MS4 standard is a big part of that and should be helpful. I would say that we're also trying to, get as much involvement as we can with some of our municipalities. When someone comes forward and has a project in their community, do they need a permit from Rice Creek? So we're trying to, build that bridge as much as we can. So, we're making sure that everyone's aware of what needs to happen before you get too far down the road, trying to avoid any sort of, hey, you needed a permit and now you're out of compliance, those sorts of things. Yeah,
And add on to that, there are a couple of communities in Rice Creek that are independently administering stormwater rules. They need to essentially develop a rule set that is either equivalent to or identical to the Rice Creek rule set. And so the district does get involved in reviewing those rules to ensure that there's a consistency with their rule set.
Yeah, Chris, that's an excellent point. Yeah, we do have 3 communities that have adopted ordinances that are equivalent or more stringent than our standards, and do review applications that, you know, then have our rules considered. And then we do work with those communities on somewhat of an annual basis to kind of check in, see how they're reviewing it, see if there's things that we would have commented on to kind of align with the rules that we have.
And backing up to the previous question about diversity and inclusion, I'm noting Beth Cranio from the Rice Creek Watershed District has chimed in on text. She noted that some Rice Creek staff have participated in training for microaggressions and are looking at equity of some of our programs. This is a possible training for a future professional development. We have been able to make some changes to improve equity. And if you are looking for support in developing the equitable processes, the Blue Thumb program has an EJ hub that provides resources and training. One more comment here from Grace Butler. Nice presentation. I would note that our district keeps a log of all variances to rules for the 10 years prior. This is a staff ledger, so we can look at concerns and patterns that need resolutions. For example, what is a trail seems to need to have definition for non-motorized or pedestrian or electric bikes, shades of gray. I would say that Rice Creek, they similarly do track variances that have occurred, and in between development of rules, we do try to keep a running tally of things that we notice may be you know, of confusion, either on a staff level reviewing or even some of the folks doing compliance reviews out in the field. So that has been the source of a number of those rule changes that we looked at. I think that's all of the comments we received there. Any other questions from folks? Certainly feel free to chime in verbally if you want, or raise your hand if you have a question.
And I would note too, I do have my contact information on this slide. So if you think of anything in the future and want to connect on that, I'd be happy to do so.
If there aren't any other questions, then I just wanted to direct everyone to the chat for the lunch session with the awards and the matinee movies. There is a link in the chat because the one that went out with the information that was sent doesn't work. So you need to use the one that's in this chat. Otherwise, thank you for your presentation, and we'll look forward to our next part of this day. Thanks.